Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß and my guest today is Richard Barbrook, who is, amongst other things, known for coining the term Californian ideology as an early critique of Silicon Valley techno-determinism. He and Andy Cameron wrote their influential essay on the subject in 1995, and the topic is as prevalent as ever. I met Richard at the 10-year anniversary of the Technopolitics Research Group here in Vienna, so shout outs to them as well. Another person whom I was happy to meet again there is Jaya Clara Brecke, my guest in episode 6, which was, up until now, the one episode in this podcast that I did in English. So if you're not fluent in German but indeed love future histories, then please go and check out episode 6 with Jaya. And whatever language you actually speak, if you like the show, then please tell a friend, or if you can, then support it on Patreon via patreon.com/futurehistories. Marian and Paula recently did just that, and I want to send my warmest thanks to them for doing so. But now, please enjoy today's episode with Richard Barbrook. Richard, you have done so many different things. I think it's easier if you introduce yourself.
Well, I teach politics at the University of Westminster in London, and I'm a founder member of Class War Games, and we also run a cooperative called Digital Liberties that makes games. And I was sitting outside a cafe in Vienna, and someone came up to talk to me, who I thought might be begging for money, but then I realised he actually did, because I'd never met the guy before. And he said, "You are the person who wrote the Californian ideology." And I said, "Yep, that is true." So that's the other thing I'm well known for. That was in 1995, where we critiqued dot-com neoliberalism before its time.
And hopefully starting a process that will eventually lead into different kinds of futures.
Yes. Well, it's one of the reasons I got interested in futures, like writing histories of the future. I wrote a book called Imaginary Futures, which is the first chapter says the future is what it used to be. So things like, predictions of artificial intelligence or, fusion power or space tourism. They've been around since at least the 1960s, and they come back with a regularity which is quite extraordinary. And of course, the information society, we're always about to transition from industrial capitalism to some sort of digital utopia. And again, that goes back to at least the 1960s, or in its Russian original version, the 1950s.
One point you're making is actually that there is this repetition of futures actually, and you pledge us to invent new imaginaries of future. So why do we need these new imaginaries of future?
Well, I think the reason is because, I've just been to visit the Red Vienna exhibition, which everybody should go and see next to the art house. And that's interesting because they had a very clear vision of the future. So people in Vienna before the First World War had terrible housing and bad healthcare and really poor education. And so to raise the mass of the population up, they had a vision of a sort of social democratic transition to communism. And what you need to do is have a healthy, educated and well-housed proletariat. And then they went and did it. And it's quite extraordinary achievement. And present-day Vienna still benefits from that attempt. And that's an example of if the left needs a way of thinking about a future. Because when you start doing things now, they're like a beta version of what's going to come eventually. And so if you don't have that idea of an imaginary future, you're in a bit of a problem, because the right does have an imaginary future. It has a sort of neoliberal dystopia, which in Britain it's called Brexit. So you turn yourself into a sort of fantasy version of America, basically.
Or even worse, native nationalism.
That is partly America, yes, of course. Yeah. Having lived there, I went to school in America where they used to make them all pledge allegiance to the flag every morning, which as a little English person I thought was very weird. So they have to inculcate to a nation, a multinational country, and homogenise them into one thing called Americans.
So how could these like really radically different imaginary futures look like? Because I mean, there's social democracy, but we kind of had that, and it's at the end. I mean, at least in the way it has been done, like the last 40, 50 years, it has always been a compromise between a social welfare state and a capital market.
I met an English guy who's living here in the exhibition, who was lecturing me about the awfulness of British politics because you don't want to compromise. And I was saying, well, in England you can't compromise. That's the problem. You have that advantage that I was told by an Austrian of the post-war generation who said the socialists and the Christian Democrats learned to compromise in the concentration camp. You've had that inbuilt into the system because of the trauma of the Civil War and the Nazi occupation and all the rest of it, and the Second War, and which you lost. Very badly. But
the imaginaries that you are calling for, they are aiming for something different, no?
Exactly.
For something more,
Exactly.
What does it look like?
If you went to Britain today and showed them Red Vienna, that would look like an imaginary future. 60% social housing, really good welfare services. It's a very paternalistic vision of social democracy, but nonetheless, compared to lots of places in England today, and especially in America, it would seem even more utopian. That sort of vision, I agree with you, does seem dated. Though, of course, if you're Chinese, it seems like the future, of course. They are building social housing on a massive scale and all this sort of stuff, and adding digital technology to it. And they do think that they're going to build communism in 30 or 40 years. Oh, yes, I met somebody from a party school in Beijing who confidently predicted that they would be there in 50 years.
Really?
And I said, I come back in 20 years' time and it'll still be 50 years away, won't it?
Yeah, because to me it doesn't look that way. I mean, they are actually more going to a engineered capitalism, no?
Confucian Socialism, as Daniel Bell's son calls it.
Ah, right, that's the term, I see.
Well, it's got a sort of, they've had a long tradition for 1,000, well, Confucius is 2,500 years ago, this vision that you have an enlightened elite who look after the people. But it's really comes from the Han Dynasty, doesn't it? It's like 1,000.
So what's
500 years ago, whatever.
Sorry, what's the future that you are imagining?
I think we should think that partly it is a reassertion, though, of the old socialist future. I think that is an important part of it. It's interesting that one of the things that I found with Continentals, and they think what's happened in the Labour Party recently, is they find quite strange is this reassertion of socialist iconography. So if you think of something like Podemos in Spain, they got rid of the red flag and the International and all this sort of stuff. Whereas in England, that's seen as quite important to reassert that continuity with working class history. Back to, obviously England's had a long history of working class struggle back to the early 19th century. So, an interesting thing is, so one of the things which would be seen as an imaginary future or a vision of the future is the Labour Party had a conference about 18 months ago called Alternative Models of Ownership, where obviously the neoliberal model has failed, privatisation, deregulation, and so how do you replace that? One thing is to go back to the old state capitalist nationalised industries. That seems not a good idea. So the alternative models of ownership is to look at things like municipal ownership, obviously what a lot of Red Vienna would be quite an inspiration, but also particularly cooperatives. Cooperatives were developed in mid-19th century England, consumer co-ops, housing cooperatives, and producer cooperatives. And so if you look at place like Preston, which is the city in the north of England, the local council has actually started to develop a local cooperative economy, partly to keep money. When they previous councils privatised services, money was being taken out of the local economy by the privatised providers of services. If you hand them over to cooperatives, the money tends to stay within the local institutions. And this is now seen as a model for creating a new type of socialism that's based on not just replacing private managers with state managers, but actually to democratise the economy. And this comes back to a lot of thought that was done critiques actually of the old type state system, that that they trusted managers and people who were basically white collar. This was a paternalistic. This would be the downside of the Red Vienna model. This very paternalistic view. But if you've got an educated workforce, they ought to be able to run the system themselves. Who knows how best to run a railway? This is John McDonnell, who's the finance spokesman of the Labour Party, and he would say, well, who knows how best to run a railway? It's not the managers, it's the people who drive the trains, maintain the tracks, look after the stations. They know how to run the railway. So what you have to do is get what's often called their tacit knowledge about the system and input that into running things. And I think that's an interesting vision, because actually that is a new modern vision, particularly if you couple it with digital technologies, using a lot of the stuff that we do in everyday life with social media and polling and all the other stuff that you can do, and allow people to pass, not just to turn up to meetings, but to contribute knowledge in other ways and to be consulted. But actually also it's going back to the middle of the 19th century. This is what English socialism was about, actually, before the First World War. So if you read Karl Marx, who's the German theorist of English socialism, in Volume 3 of Capital, he said, what's the future? It's actually not the state ownership of everything, it's the cooperative ownership of everything. He's quite explicit about that. And that comes from that experience. So that's a good example where, in a sense, you have to look back at old versions of the future and then think about how they can be redesigned and inspire us to think about how do we create a new version. Because obviously the problems we're facing are in some ways the same. Capitalist alienation, exploitation, in some senses have intensified, but on the other hand, they're very different, because we have a very different workforce, for instance, much more ethnically diverse, gender, all these other issues have to go into, and I think crucially, it's much, much better educated. So if you have a better educated workforce, more skilled, it's going to think about how it wants to run its own life in a very different way than people who are desperate, who are very happy if people provide them with housing and education and healthcare and all the rest of it, particularly if it's done by a very enlightened leadership. Now I think people feel that they want a say in all this, in a real say as well, not just ticking boxes.
Mm-hmm. So that means the transition would actually start in the here and now by establishing worker-owned cooperatives that serve as practical examples for this kind of economic structure. But there would still be a market mechanism that is in place in between the different cooperatives. Is that just a transitional phase, or is it also, what about markets? Are they a part of the structure that you are aiming for? Is it like market socialism, or will there be a transition that, for example, involves abolishing money and
the commodity?
Yeah.
Abolishing the commodity labour power. Yes, this is the ultimate appeal. We used to read this book by a guy called Jan Appel called Communist Production and Distribution, which I finally managed to get a copy of at the Anarchist Book Fair a few years ago. And that's quite interesting re-looking at that, because he was a Dutch council communist. So he was writing, must have been in the late 20s, 1920s, early 1930s. And it's, how do you do that? It's really interesting. How would you do that? How, if you actually wanted to get rid of money? And it's always been this conundrum. I mean, Robert Owen, who's the founder of English socialism, thought you could just replace gold pieces with labour notes. You do 1 hour of this and 1 hour of that, and you just swap the note. But as Marx points out in the introduction to Grundrisse, what happens is that the labour note slowly turns into money and becomes the regulator and commodifies the labour. Yeah, and so that he has this really interesting problem. And you think now, of course, with digital technologies, a lot of this sort of state planning, which went massively out of fashion after the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly it seems a lot more rational. You know, I wrote about the invention of the internet in America, where they pumped huge amounts of money in the 1960s to inventing this very esoteric computer network, because they were terrified that the Soviet Union was doing it. And one of the reasons the Soviet Union wanted it is because they had the idea that they could replace the state plan with a giant mainframe that would instantly, you know, you go into a shop and buy red socks and it would send back a message to the sock factory saying, produce more socks in this size and the colour red. And of course, this seemed incredibly utopian then, but of course, now every supermarket does it with barcodes. Yeah.
And it's a debate that is being revived, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this book, The People's Republic of Walmart, by Laith Phillips and Mark, Michael Rozwowski.
Well, it also goes back to the people. There's been a really renewed interest in what happened in Chile with Stafford Beer and Cybersyn. I've met Raul Espejo. There's this brilliant book by Eden Medina, which is called Cybernetic Revolution. It was originally going to be called Cybernetic Socialism, but surprise, surprise, MIT Press quickly changed the title, which is interesting because in a way they weren't revolutionaries, they were much more socialist. But again, in America, I guess words mean certain things, don't they? And that's also an interesting where, you know, they're using like one mainframe and telex machines. Though the control room looks very good, where you have all these guys at the top. They're basically the guys who are coordinating the distribution of information. It's not really a top-down thing; it's a sort of coordination. And they all have these wonderful 70s chairs and they have a space for their glass of whiskey and cigars. Like a sort of gentleman's club.
Yeah.
Stafford Beer obviously thought there was nothing too good for the workers. So that, I think, is interesting. So there's that. And obviously the other thing that people don't talk about, but I think is the real big thing, is China, because they still have state planning on a massive scale. And one of the, it's the fastest growing economy in world history. It is the great transformation of our generation. It is China in the last 70 years, and particularly in the last 30, 40 years. I mean, and state planning is absolutely at the core of this process.
Yeah, well, but I think that the general argument from the other side would then be to say, well, it might be that they still are dominant in terms of planning, but just after they opened their market to a capitalist market logic of competition and for-profit production, they made this like huge jump, and that this would actually underline the effectiveness of markets and for-profit motive.
Though on the flight here, I think it's called China Daily or something, I got a copy of, and it's interesting because they're talking about the 70th anniversary, and they quite correctly point out, you couldn't have had that leap without the previous Mao period, where they increased, the lifespan of the population from the average age was 35, and it increased to 64 under Mao's reign. I mean, extraordinary. Education, health, that, to actually have those people who are ready to make that transition. So you can't really disentangle one from the other. I think a lot of historians now are starting to get away from that ideological debate. I think for us, obviously, it's like talking about Red Vienna, isn't it? It's an interesting historical example, but we're faced with very different problems, I think. And I think what the question you ask is correct, which is, you can take some mixture of the plan and the market, and you can massively raise living standards. And you could, in England, we could build 2 million social housing. We could lower people's housing costs massively if we essentially reversed what Thatcher and her successors did, which is sell off housing and allow a huge bubble to take place and all the rest of it. That's possible. We know how you can do that, and you can do it even within the capitalist system. The question then is, but how do we move beyond that? Because a lot of the problems people have, a great example is mental health, for instance, is to do with the stress of living under this capitalist society. It causes record levels of depression and, various other ailments. And that is to do because people they live socially alienated lives, meaningless lives, they think. And so you need to create that. Again, that's a sort of different level of problems, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the problem then lies at the end. If you go down the rabbit hole, it lies within the question of political economy and
exactly. And
how
that's where
figure it in the DNA, in the DNA of the political economy.
Well, of course. I mean, because, a lot of political economy had those questions, and then they very deliberately, in the academic system, split them in half. Politics, I mean, I teach politics, and then there's another profession called economics. And it's interesting that you could spend 3 years at a university doing a politics degree and know nothing about economics, but how you could talk about the modern state without it being a class state or a bureaucratic state or all these other things. That it's like that because of this transformation that took place where we moved from feudalism to capitalism, however you put it, whatever that means. But the difference between a medieval way people produce wealth, as Adam Smith would say, the wealth of nations. The difference between that and how we live now is just profound, and that creates changes in the politics, in culture, in interpersonal relationships, and all the rest of it. And so it's extraordinary. You can do, and then you have economics, which is just like astrology. It's just a sort of very complicated mathematics, garbage in, garbage out, basically. And that's the fact that these people are even considered to be academically credible is what I find extraordinary.
So one of the tasks at hand, I guess, would be to implement profound change within the economics departments at the universities. I mean,
abolish them. But the statistical. I mean, to be fair, obviously in bourgeois economics, as we used to call it, there is very good statistical work going on, but it's just like the basic ground theory. The fact that when I was taught A-level economics, that's 16. I was 16 and I did economics at school. And I remember Trevor Jones was our teacher, and the first lesson of my first year of economics, 2 years of economics, he did the demand and supply curve on the board and said it's all wrong, but you have to learn it to pass the exam. And it was only many years later when I read Adam Smith and David Ricardo and, of course, Karl Marx, I realised what he meant. It's like the wrong answer to the wrong question.
But
so to do something like that, where you have a profession whose most basic theory is such in error, they don't know what a price is, and they don't understand how prices are defined either. So that's a bit problematic when you're studying capitalist economies.
But that's a very interesting point, because I think that's exactly one of the points that we need to address, because it works as a narrative.
As an ideology.
Yeah.
It works an idea. But it does work. It also works if you want to collect large amounts of statistical data, because it talks about the surface forms of capitalism. So one of its functions is to create have large data sets, and then you can say something about, I don't know, what the stock market is going to be like in a year's time or whatever, usually wrongly, or what the growth rate is, all these sort of things. But what it can't say is, why is there a capitalist crisis? They can't. The most fundamental thing of the last 10 years has been the implosion of the near implosion of the financial system, and the really bad policies that were adopted to prop up the world system in the last decade. They can't talk about that because they actually don't have the theoretical tools that allow them to understand it. And that is really interesting. But it's not just that. I don't think it's just the shifting of economics from politics, but the way that anthropology is a separate, history is over here, cultural studies is over. There's a whole series of these of this division of labour within intellectual life, which isn't talking to each other. And then once they stay in their little bubble, especially as academics are a bit like. I don't know. They're a bit like monasteries in the medieval period, where they're all doing their own, chanting Latin masses, as far as the rest of the population are concerned. They're completely outside practical engagement in what society is doing, which again is okay because it's good that they're accumulating knowledge about obscure things, but it's not being reintegrated back into our society. And precisely for the problem you're talking about, if we want to think about how do we go beyond capitalism, broadly defined, we actually have to be able to draw on all this human experience and think about how you do things like complicated things like divide and distribute labour, create social wealth in a way that people don't find alienating, find fulfilling, have time to look after their children, and all the other things. Having a son, I always think that's the most important thing in life, is hanging out with him.
But could you like briefly sketch how this could be done, or like because I mean, if we talk macro level-ish kind of things, and we just briefly touched the socialist calculation debate and how they.
Well, the Austrians, you also, it's interesting that
Austrian Economics, I'll have to, you mean Austrian Economics or Austrians?
No, the Austrian Economics, which was for people who hated Red Vienna. So you think like Hayek, Mises, Schumpeter to a lesser extent, but basically they all hate it. You can think Hayek was a snob, wasn't he? And the idea that the proles would actually have decent housing and hang out in coffee bars was probably his idea of hell. And he just spent the rest of his life trying to... it's interesting because The Road to Serfdom, which was Margaret Thatcher's favourite book, which he wrote in exile in London. And what he says there is if you set up a national health service, our social, Britain's probably greatest beloved institution, it's the straight run to the Gulag Archipelago. It's a completely batshit crazy book. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Thatcher being elected, so I went and read this book because it said this is her favourite book. So I was going around telling people, I said, this is like Mein Kampf. This is, read it because this is what she's going to do. This is craziness, but she's going to do. They believe this rubbish, and they did. That's exactly what they did. So if we want to go back to actually countering that, we need our own type of narratives, which again take things like the socialist calculation debate and say, well, actually, you were wrong. You can calculate in different ways. Particularly now we've got all this computing power that allows us to calculate. But the question is, what are you calculating? And what is the purpose of this calculation? Yeah. Because otherwise you end up like in Chinese central planning,
Exactly. I guess, these are 2 points, I guess. One is that we need to define what we are aiming for in the sense of what's the purpose, because we agree that the purpose being just profit is one of the huge problems right now. So we can put in something like general well-being, for everybody,
happiness,
each individual. But then there's a question of how to. But I think
Stafford Beer had a really great idea, which is you go to, I don't know, you go to hotels or restaurants or no more like public transport or something. They have these little smileys which go. I don't know whether you have them here. They are like dark green, light green, moderate colour, something on red. So whether you're happy or sad. And you press them, and he wanted to actually have them in everybody's home, and everybody every day would vote whether they were happy or sad. Mm-hmm. So nothing else, just whether they're happy. And obviously some people will be sad because they're sick or they've quarrelled with their partner or something. But he just said, on general, that the government would know every day whether it was that people were happier than sad.
So you just said the government. That's my point of entry, I guess, because
Well, he was doing it for the Chilean.
Yeah. I know. I think my question is just there's this. I do see one of the narratives popping up that against the Austrian narrative of price as being the supreme price and market mechanisms being the supreme mechanism of allocation of resources.
You have Austro-Marxism. You can have the Austro-Marxist approach instead.
Well, and then there's this. There's the narrative that is popping up right now, which is kind of all right. We can see in large-scale companies like Walmart or Amazon and anything that planned economy is possible in general. So let's try this with different goals, of course, not for profit, but that would imply some kind of centrally planned economy. But it seems as if what you're promoting is not a centrally planned economy, but a more decentralized.
Well, centralization is almost inevitable, though, in a way, because you think about the world economy, it's sort of slowly going into three zones, isn't it? China, Europe and North America. And these are very large. Europe is a very large group of people who are all, we might be think we're very diverse, but to outsiders, they all think we're the same. I had a Chinese student this year who came up with, she said to me, looked at me very seriously, she said, I don't understand why the Europeans keep quarrelling with each other. Why don't you form a strong centralised state like we did? It's been very successful.
From which country was she?
China.
China. Ah, okay, yeah.
So for as far as she's concerned, the last 70 years is the best in Chinese history. And it's because they created in 1945 a strong centralised state, and it's driven the country forward into the, prosperity. A mediumly prosperous ecological civilization, or whatever the latest phraseology is.
So, but what would be your approach?
I don't think I'm not really in favour of Confucian socialism. Yes,
but what are you in favour for?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think it's interesting that from the experiences of Labour local governments in the 1980s, which is the present leadership of the Labour Party comes very much out of the Greater London Council, the GLC, and other left Labour councils in the 1980s. Things that Thatcher closed down because they were two good examples of what you could do instead. And a lot of that was moving away from top-down paternalistic, and to create bottom-up cooperative type structures. But I don't think it's a centralisation decentral, because often to make you need economies of scale often to make them work. So it's not like the Preston model. If they just had a few co-ops, that works. But once you start getting lots of co-ops and they all start to collaborate with each other, sometimes they might be buying and selling, other times they just might be working together in other ways, you start to actually generate more productive wealth. But also I think the other key thing is it empowers people and it changes people politically and culturally, and they feel more self-confident. That's the other key thing. The other problem, the Hayekian model, of course, is it just treats people as disposable commodities. And, we have zero hours contracts and stress. And as I said, all the stuff we were talking about before. And if you create healthier and happier people, that's what they want to do. People want to contribute. They would like to contribute to society, but they need to be happy as well. So that seems to be a key thing to make. So I'm a bit wary about the centralisation, decentralisation debate, particularly because of Brexit. Suddenly everyone's in favour of the Federal Republic of Europe. That's one thing the Brexiteers have done. They've actually made the English, who had the major Europhobic problem, they've actually created a mass pro-European movement in England, which is bizarre. I never thought I'd see demonstrations with large numbers of people flying European flags. And then if you go to the Labour Party, the two flags that people have on their badges and all the rest of it are one, Palestine, for obvious reasons, and the second is the European Union, which seemed like a strange combination.
You can see that all around, I guess, because oftentimes it's also in the public discourse, that's how it is being presented. Yeah. It's either the right-wing nationalists or the liberalism as we knew it, and it in the let's say mainstream media, in lack of any other term, it's described as if there's nothing else, Well,
that's what that is the classic mainstream media, like the choice between a liberal or a fascist.
Yeah,
Macron had it. The Macron election. You have a choice between a liberal or a fascist.
Yeah.
What's a choice? That's not a choice.
So you'll opt for
socialism,
cybernetic communism. I read somewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Do you have a catchy phrase how you define cybernetic communism?
Well, that came out of the Imaginary Futures book. I was interested. This came from this thing that the origin myth of the internet is that somehow it was a system to survive a nuclear war. This goes back to the Paul Barron reports in the early 1960s. He wrote for the Rand Corporation, funded by the US Air Force, and notorious for promoting the invasion of Vietnam. But it just struck me as that was just like very unlikely. Why would you replace cheap, reliable switches with expensive, flaky mainframes? I mean, we're not talking about the sort of chips we have in our mobile phones. We're talking about computers the size of a room, right? So this just didn't make sense. And so it was only digging. Actually, I didn't even do that much research, but once you actually go and read some of the conferences from the early 1960s, like the 1964 American Cybernetics Society being an obvious example, they're terrified. They all said the Russians are going to build the internet within 4 years. So that's why they're doing it, because they've had Sputnik. The Americans lost the race to put the first satellite, and then you have Yuri Gagarin. They lost the race to put the first human into space, and Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman into space. So they, all these key milestones on that particular thing. That's why they always go on about landing on the moon, because they have to say that they lost all the early parts of the space race. So that they then invented ARPA, or the Advanced Research Project Agency, and its next project was to stop cybernetic communism. Nikita Khrushchev, in the 22nd Party Congress, actually said the Soviet Union will enter cybernetic communism in the 1970s. That we will solve all the problems of central planning by building a giant mainframe.
But they didn't. I mean, there was the attempt in Chile with Stafford Beer, and there were attempts in the
No, they got terrified.
Soviet
They got
Union
scared because in 1968, during the Prague Spring, Radovan Ritkar and the Academy of Art Sciences in Czechoslovakia published his book called Civilization at the Crossroads, and it says in there, Stalinism is the industrial age, and we're about to enter the information society, and this will be cybernetic communism. Bye the party. And so they just got really scared. They suddenly thought, well, if we set up computer networks everywhere. So they weren't as clever as the Chinese, you see. They just got terrified. They just thought people would use it to self-organize, which of course they did. But, still couldn't stop solidarity in Poland, could they?
So that's interesting. So everybody shut down the different way of approaching cybernetics. Actually, the United States shut it down in Chile, and the Soviets did it by themselves. Actually, they didn't need somebody else to do it. No.
Well, that's one of the reasons they didn't get the internet. I think it's really interesting. I have friends who grew up in the Soviet, and every computer network was you couldn't actually operate from one network to the other. They already did this with telephones. They used to have layered telephone systems, which is why if you see those pictures of Soviet bureaucrats, they have like 6 telephones on their desk, because it shows that you got more telephones the further you went up the hierarchy, because you got access to a special network. And they did the same thing because they were afraid if you had one telephone system, anybody could ring anybody else. And that's another thing. When we come back to when we're thinking about how modernity has progressed, the command and control, top-down command and control, is a really important thing, because at each stage of technology there's a debate, a struggle, actually, a social shaping of technology, as it's said in the academic debate, over who's going to control it. Is it going to be bottom up, or is it going to be top down? And the internet is a very classic example of that.
And it's a super important part you're just mentioning, because one of the titles of a chapter within an essay that Evgeny Morozov just recently published in the New Left Review, the whole essay is called Digital Socialism. But one of the chapters, it's titled Socialize the Means of Feedback Production! ! So that would be an obvious barrier, so because right now the means of feedback production that would actually be the ground upon which such a cybernetic planned economy could be done, they are right now owned privately by huge corporations, and a necessary step would be to socialize these means of feedback production.
Or to supersede them. That's in a sense. But you think something like Google is effectively owned by the state. I mean, it's a creation of the National Security Agency,
But it's not owned by the state.
But it's effectively controlled by the Americans. I mean, when they go on about
by the Americans, but not by the state, no?
Well, by the elite, then, okay. I mean, but you think when they go on about Huawei, and the back doors allegedly in its technology, and you think they're just talking about themselves. That's what they're doing. What's Google? It's a giant information machine. We're sucking up data for the national security state in America. I mean, you've got a choice now. Do you want to be spied, use Apple and be spied on by the American secret police, or Huawei and be spied on by the Chinese secret police? I mean, there's a great choice for you, isn't it?
Yeah, so there would have to be a different kind of so I don't think it's about.
So when you talk about socializing, they are socialized already. It's just how they're socialized. So what does it? Social. It's what Marx points out in Volume 3 of Capital. A joint stock company is a form of social ownership. It's just a social ownership. It's structured in a particular way, to benefit a particular class. But it says so. It's not individual ownership. It is a form of social ownership. So Google is a form of social ownership, which the two founders basically own it outright. I mean, the shares are traded, but they can't appoint the board of directors. So who they're accountable to, I mean, that's another question. I said it was originally funded by the NSA. So you could think if you go back enough through the interconnections of the American elite.
But it's not possible to, right now, it's the information that is selected, it's not possible to use, to build some, cooperative project built upon the data that is being collected by Google because they are protecting it.
Well, not just that. It's that what we've all been using Google for 20 odd years and building up its knowledge base. That's the key thing. If you could theoretically build a better search engine, but what you wouldn't have is 20 years of searches done by billions of people, and that's what gives it its edge over anybody else. Is that embedded knowledge which everybody has. We've all helped build Google or Apple or Amazon or any of these companies. So it is, in a way, they are socialized. It's just how they're socialized. They're not. It's not. Again, it's not. The Austrian school is all about the individual consumer. But that's actually not how society. We're talking about millions, billions of people collectively creating something. How it's captured and moulded, that's a completely different question. But I think socialization is the wrong word.
Oh, really? Interesting.
They are already socialized. They've been socialized. They've always been socialized. They were socialized when they were funded at Stanford University. Corporations are social institutions. They just run as dictatorships.
Well, I think with the word socialized, I associate the common ownership, that everybody would have access to the benefits of it.
Well, you do. You do with Google. You can use it for free.
Well, yeah, I can use it to Google something by which I just add some more of the information to their like databases. Exactly. But we want to get our hands on the databases.
And you benefit from that. The fact that they've accumulated all this knowledge. You type something rather esoteric into it, it suddenly throws up. I mean, a lot of it is junk. But then by going through it and you help them sort it by what's relevant, and then the next person who types in the same piece of rubbish gets hopefully gets a more accurate feeding. So
yeah. But still, I do not get it, because I mean, if you take some industry and it builds some houses, and I can profit by living in this house, it's still the company that builds the houses is not socialized, because the means of production are not within common ownership. So that would be
the joint stock is a form of common ownership.
Come again, sorry.
It is a form of common ownership. It's just run as a dictatorship. It's not in the sort of Austrian school fantasy economics that you're taught at school, or even Keynesian, but you are always treated as an individual. It's all about individual consumers, individual producers. But that's why the joint stock company becomes an immediate problem. There's, I don't know, the theory of the firm and all that sort of stuff. I mean, one that thing is that they prove that companies, by definition, can be more efficient than markets. That's what Adam Smith says at the beginning of Volume 1 of The Wealth of Nations. There's two ways of dividing and distributing labour. One is the market, the other is the firm, or the state, depending on how you look at it. The plan, whatever you call it. And there's two different ways. And so this is not something new that you can the pin factory is not a market. They don't buy and sell each of the bits of the pin to each other. But you could do it like that, theoretically. I mean, to a Hayekian, you think that's actually how you do it. They don't want to have the firm at all, really. They just want to have everything, internal markets for everything.
There are people who tried that and failed miserably.
I know they tried it at our university. They were going to have us all bidding for office space in the same way.
Really?
Oh, yeah, this was like I think it was the Blair period where they got even more bizarrely entranced by all this. But you can see again. You can see that in the EU where markets become a sort of technocratic solution because they're not democratic by definition. And you want to have a solution, and it all looks very nice. You can just set down a set of policies, and it works in inverted commas. So I think that's the problem. So when you talk about socializing something like that, they already are social. It's just that they're not democratic or open. That's the key thing. So what you should be talking about is democratizing them or opening them up and sharing the knowledge.
That's also, I think, a very, because our starting point somehow was the need for new imaginaries, and I think this is a very nice imaginary to democratize economies.
I work with a colleague called Christian Fuchs. He's a very very smart guy, but he was going on about nationalizing Google basically. And that's what friends of mine pointed out. One, it basically is national. In one sense, it is nationalised because of its connection with the security apparatus. And the second thing, the whole point is actually to get away from that type of model of software. Having one giant big server, basically model of software. I mean, they write software, so they would say, well, that's part of the problem. Just turning it from nominally owned by its two founders and Wall Street investors, the venture capitalists or whatever. I think it is basically owned by the two founders nowadays, because all the rest of the shares don't actually have any voting rights. But it doesn't really matter. It's actually the model of centralising all the information in one company is the problem. And really, what you want to do is have distributed forms of if you're going to do a search engine, it should be a distributed search engine, not this particular model that came out of the 1990s. So I think that's an interesting debate where they're actually saying, well, it's not just taking the same technology and just changing the ownership to Google PLC or private corporation to state corporation or. Well, it's something more than that, or even calling it a co-op, a co-op of its workers or something. It's actually to change the technology itself. That part of the problem is that it's designed as top-down technology. And so simply just changing the ownership, calling it socialized. Yeah. It's like, as I said, it's like Confucian Socialism, isn't it? Yeah, it's another form of Confucian Socialism. And what you really want to do is actually not only change its ownership, but change the type of software and the way the software operates in the network. And I'm not an expert in writing software or hardware, but this seems to be a very interesting idea when we come back to the shaping of technology. That it looks, we go around doing things because it's, the loss of social relations are embedded in the technologies that we use. Hardwares and software, and so we just adopt type of behaviour patterns because it's essentially that's how it's the easy way to operate your life basically, and it's teaching you to operate in a sense of social relation. So simply to declare Google red, it's actually not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Especially as it already distributes its product for free anyway. So it's not as if it is communism. It's free. I hope they charged me €5 to go to that exhibition. I thought that was quite ironic, really.
The Musa? Yeah.
I said it's socialism. It should be free, mate. They haven't got to communism yet. They're obviously just in the transitional phase, aren't they? Where they still have to charge you money to go in.
Another approach that is currently discussed, or actually since like 3 or 4 years, is being put out there, and that I wanted to check what your position is towards, is this concept of fully automated luxury communism by Aaron Bastani.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. I read that book. I actually had to debate with Aaron
Ah, nice.
on his book tour. That was
I'll
great.
have to check that one. Is there a video of that?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. It's in. It was done in Newspeak House. Yeah. It's,
Okay, I have to get my hands on this audio or video recording.
yeah, well,
So-
sorry, it was done for Virtual Futures. That's right. I'm trying to think.
All right. So you like the book, you like the concept.
Do I like the book? That's a really good question. I was being very polite. I could have been nastier to it, but I think the good thing, I think there's lots of problems with the book. I mean, there's all the things like mining asteroids, which are completely bonkers in my view. But that's a different question. I think what's good about it is it's very positive. And what you need, as you said, in a way, it's not so much whether or not you agree with the utopia. It's the fact that people are going out and saying, well, we can build a post-capitalist society. It's very technological determinism. That's my problem with it.
All right.
And because I think, and I just have being, as I said, having read Capital, I have a big problem with the words fully automated, because I think that actually is a vision of being dominated by technology, because that's not reshaping the machine. That's expelling living labour from the production process, which you don't want to do. What you want to be able to do is control the production of goods and services. That's like, it's like basic income. I always feel this is a very dubious concept, because welfare for all, that's quite good when you're in your 20s. You think that's great. I could just go and collect a cheque every week and have fun. But I don't think that really what you really want to do is have basic services. The good example in Britain is that healthcare is free, and so Thatcher would have loved to privatise. If we'd had charging for healthcare, we'd have really expensive healthcare now. But because it was free, she couldn't do it. They can try and privatise the back end, but if you try to introduce charging for healthcare in England, there'd be a revolt, even among right-wing voters. And so that's a really interesting thing. So there was a discussion in the 1980s about abolishing public transport fares, which I spoke in favour of when they did this. And the unions didn't want to do this because there were people involved in selling and collecting tickets. Okay. But if they'd abolished fares, they couldn't have reintroduced them. I just think now we have very expensive public transport in London, but I think if they abolished it, it's very, very difficult to reintroduce it once it's done.
That's a very good point you're making, I guess, because that would be a essential first step would be to create universal basic services for housing, for transport, for education, for health, and really build thick structures around it that are able to last for a long, long time, and thereby...
Well, it's the same with universities, because university used to be free, and then...
Well, it is here.
Yeah, exactly, and then Blair introduced very low fees, and there were people who kept making excuses, and I remember saying at the time, well, if you introduce low fees, they'll be higher, because that's the point, it's just to get people used to paying something. And once you pay something, then you can charge them $50,000 a year. And that is the point. So I think one of the things is taking things out of the market, really the basic things in life, healthcare, education, housing. And then you can have, people want to buy and sell other things. That's fine.
What's the next step after that? If let's imagine a future where this has happened, where universal basic services,
where our little children are going to
do a Keynesian, the future of my grandchildren kind of thing. What would that be?
What do you mean, the 4-day week, the 3-day week, that sort of thing. The other Labour Party's actually adopted a policy of introducing a 4-day week.
Yeah.
Which again, it's one of the mistakes the French Socialist Party did, is they reduced the working week, but not by a whole day. And so it's been very difficult in France to push work back up again. So and it doesn't seem to have affected the French economy that hugely. But they're always, if you read right-wing papers, they're always going on and on about the restriction on the working week. But you think if they give them a whole extra day off, that would have really screwed. Because, they've never been able to, even the Popular Front in the 1936 Front Populaire, they introduced the Grandes Vacances, which, so basically France closes down in August, thanks to the workers rebellion in 1936. It's a bit annoying sometimes when you're a tourist, but but you do think that was an achievement. And the same thing in England. We basically from Christmas Eve to past New Year's Eve, the whole of England closes down, and this is from the 1970s strikes. We had all these massive strikes. And the great achievement, even now, despite all these decades of neoliberalism, is the whole country closes down on Christmas Eve and doesn't reopen until after New Year's Day. So those sorts of spaces, I think, are interesting. It's interesting, though, things like National Health Service and the long winter Christmas holiday. It's interesting what they found really difficult to roll back. That shows you what are really powerful achievements that people aren't really willing to give up, however much shit they read in from the mainstream media.
So we've got this like next step thing, which would be the universal basic services kind of thing. And then from there, where do we go?
A shorter working week. I think that would make people happy.
And then after that,
what?
If we get a 4-day week, with the same payment, of course, then a 3-day week, and then.
What you mean, Ecotopia?
I don't know. Where do we go from there? What's the what are you pushing for?
We hunt in the morning and read poetry in the afternoon.
That would be one of the not final is of course the wrong term and the wrong idea to it, but that would be a
Charles Fourier, who thought you should overcome the division of labour. That's what every 4 hours you'd switch jobs or.
Yeah, but you needn't have to do that, But for me at least, there's an inner image where I'm free to do the work that I intrinsically want to do. And I'm not a lazy person. I just want to decide myself what I want to put my efforts in. And
also people like being with other people, and if they've got a collective project that's to the social benefit, it makes them feel happy doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the difficulty is how do you turn the sort of production of goods and services that we have into a society which is democratic, because it's been so built on class hierarchy. It's funny that here you get people who claim that this isn't a class. They say, "Oh, England's terrible; it's divided into classes," as if Austria isn't divided. I just look at them with that absolutely black. I think, but obviously again the ideology here is it's all social consensus, everyone's happy and. And there are still people, in the hotel, cleaning the hotel we're in, and waiting in bars.
So maybe it's counterproductive, but still I have to ask, let's put a name tag on it.
Communism.
All right.
Just to annoy Americans. I never used to call myself a communist until I started going to America as an adult, and then you realise, because you say anything left-wing and you try and explain, I'm a social democrat or a whatever, and then you just gave up and you say, no, I'm a communist. And then they get, probably not now, but I always remember that people would be really shocked. They never met anybody who actually would say this and not be, a Stalinist or something.
Yeah. And I just recently heard that, because I'm really interested, I heard that there are people calling themselves radical social democrats. That I never heard of that before, but I just recently heard it.
I used to say we should call ourselves libertarian social democrats, because that's LSD.
Okay, I see.
So I've got the class of the new. It has this at the end, libertarian social, because it was his joke, and I just thought it was such a great. And the funny thing is, the only person who got the joke was the Russians. The Russians got the joke immediately, and no one else did. So they all got the joke.
One last question I'm always asking: if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
My little boy. I think he's my future. So some Christian came up to me outside the shopping centre and said, "What will happen to you? Will you live on after death?" And I pointed to Artie and said, "Look, here he is." I think it makes you optimistic. You see them growing up. Hopefully, we leave them a better world.
Richard, thanks a lot.
Cheers. Thank you. Long live Red Vienna.
That was our show for today. If you want to know more about Future Histories, please visit futurehistories.today. You can support Future Histories at Patreon. For this, go to patreon.com/futurehistories and let me know what you think about this episode and the show in general. For this, use Twitter, #FutureHistories, or Reddit, or send me an email to future_histories@protonmail.com. See you next time.